Good morning, everyone, once again. Am I on or off right now? On? Yes? On. Good. Sorry. Sometimes I subconsciously turn it off and on, and I'm not always sure what's happening. This is part 2 of a little emphasis that we're doing, a big emphasis that we're doing on the Lord's table. You see that the Lord's table is present in the middle of our assembly as a symbol. And we talked about how that this was kind of the dream of Alexander Campbell, who is kind of the father of Churches of Christ and had great influence in why we are who we are. And he said, if I had my ideal worship service, it'd be a table and no pulpit, and everyone gathered around the table in the middle. And that's what we've been doing for the last couple weeks. Again, today, emphasis will be around time at the table. I'm going to try to do another short sermon. And it's not an easy task because I'm going to try to summarize a rough outline of a whole book here. This is a book by Gordon T. Smith that's called A Holy Meal, the Lord's Supper in the Life of the Church. And what Gordon T. Smith does is offer 7 different perspectives on the Lord's Supper that all converge, with Jesus and the community and that sort of thing. So, and it's a great book. I agree with him some places, disagree with him in some other places. But the most important thing that we're going to do is, when I was reading it, I pictured a table with what is in his case 7 different views or 7 different perspectives on Lord's Supper. And what we're going to do today by way of illustration is use 7 different chairs to illustrate 7 different things that are happening at the Lord's table. So what we're asking is, when we gather around this table, what is God doing? And what are we doing? The text we read today is in Luke chapter 24. And I think we have that on the board here. At the end of Luke chapter 24 and verse 30, it's one of the most important texts in all of Luke's gospel. Luke's gospel, one of the major themes in Luke's gospel is table fellowship. There's story after story after story about the table and about meals and about what happens at those tables and at meals. The same thing continues on into the book of Acts, part 2 of Luke's writings. And Luke emphasizes this table so much so that every story he tells has the Lord's Supper in view. Luke is writing to maybe like second generation of Christians, and he's using these images of Jesus at the table to communicate something about what the church does when they gather around the table. And the culmination of Luke's gospel, the final story around the table, is this one, with people who have lost hope and are distraught, and they wonder, what was Jesus and who was Jesus, and I don't know what. We had hope and we believed in something, but now all that's gone, and the story is over. And Luke says, do you know what happened to them when Jesus came alongside of them and went to their house and sat around the table? In verse 30, when he had reclined at the table with them, he took the bread and blessed it, and breaking it, he began to give it to them. And there around the table, their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. Their eyes were open, and they recognized him. I think that's Luke's theology of the table. That the point of what's happening here at this table is that all of us who gather around will have our eyes opened. Even if they've been opened before and now we're lacking sight, even if we've never seen or recognized Jesus before, Jesus invites us around the table for this very thing to happen to all of us, that our eyes might be opened in the breaking of the bread, that we might recognize Jesus for the millionth time, or maybe even for the first time. Gordon T. Smith says that he offers 7 aspects. I'm just going to use chairs from over here. This will go pretty quickly. And it's okay if you can't actually see the chairs very well, but you can imagine what they look like. The first chair, the first perspective, depending on where you sit around the table, if my chair is here or here or here, I'm going to have a different perspective on what's happening, a different experience at the table, just like all of us do in our homes, at family meals, whatever. We each have our own seat, and you can sit in this seat or this seat or this seat, and from those chairs, we have a different perspective of the table and what's going on. And surely there's overlap here, okay? They're not all totally different, and they're all related, but they're different enough that we can consider different chairs around the table. And the first one that we all know and are familiar with is the idea of a remembrance. In fact, many of us grew up with a table that had carved into the front of it, "Do this in remembrance of me," or "This do in remembrance of me," right? So important to the Lord's Supper is this aspect of remembrance, of memorial. And there's much more to be said about that. What is memorial? What is remembrance? But we're participating together in the memory of what has happened in history about Jesus who died for us. Memorial, remembrance. That's one of the chairs around the table. Another chair, obviously related to that. We can come to the table and remember and participate in that story, in that narrative. Another chair related to that is one about forgiveness, one about mercy. That in this Lord's Supper, as you and I share it, as we take it in, as we put something into our bodies, we are experiencing the grace of God, the presence of God in us, in our midst, together. Forgiveness and mercy is an important chair and aspect of this table. A third one has to do with our covenant and our commitment to Jesus. One of the most important aspects of the Lord's Supper is that you and I gather around this table because we are in covenant with God. We are in covenant with Jesus. And as we gather around the table, just like Israel did in ancient days, we gather as a community to renew our covenant to God. I could do that on an individual basis, and we do that together as a group. That's one of the longest standing aspects of the Lord's Supper, that this meal is for God's covenant people, and it's for covenant renewal. It's for us to examine ourselves, as Paul said. It's for us to recommit ourselves to God, renew that covenant again. Next chair is about communion, about fellowship. This is equally important to Jesus. That the table is not, like we talked about, something that's supposed to be individualistic. It's not just about me and God. It's about us. It's about family. It's about communion. And so an aspect of this is that aspect of fellowship. Jesus thought this is so important, that this is a meal that Jesus gave us, not the meal that Jesus gave to me, but us in community around the table, That's something that we emphasized and experienced last week heavily as we stood around the table and gathered there as a community in fellowship, as believers. And as we're gathered around the table as a community, there's also this aspect. There's general fellowship that we just talked about, general sense of community. Hey, we're part of the same family. But what do we do as a family? The root word of this meal that we celebrate is the word Eucharist. It means to give thanks. Thanksgiving is foundational to this meal. It's a process of celebration. And we're not always used to having that frame of mind and that mode operating at the table, one of thanksgiving and celebration. There's kind of a different tone when you sit around the Thanksgiving table in November and the tone that we have here at this table. Often there's a difference. But there wasn't one to the first Christians. There was a tone of thanksgiving, of celebration, of Eucharist. And so that aspect is there too. What's happening at the table? What is God doing? What are we doing? We're celebrating and giving thanks to God. Another chair is that of anticipation and hope. At the table, we don't just focus on the past or an event in history. We don't just focus on the present and what's going on with us right now in the midst of our family. We also focus on the future. There's an element of hope in the table, an element of anticipation. Paul says, as often as you eat this bread, quoting Jesus, drink this cup, or Paul's quoting the scene at the Lord's table with Jesus. And Paul says to the church, as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death, history, past. You proclaim in the present the Lord's death in the past until he comes, future. It encompasses past, present, and future, and we need to remember that there is a perspective of the table, a seat, in which we have the future in mind, a hope in the future, an anticipation for what is to come. We're proclaiming the Lord's death until he comes. And finally, as we see in Luke's gospel, as we see in John's gospel, a very important seat at the table, a perspective, an answer to the question, what is happening at the Lord's table, is nourishment. Jesus invites people in John's gospel to see and to understand that he is the bread from heaven. He invites people, not everyone's willing, in John chapter 6, to what he says, eat my flesh, drink my blood. Now, whatever those strange words might mean, and however offensive they might have been interpreted as to Jesus' hearers, many of whom walked away after that, that is nevertheless the invitation to eat my flesh, to drink my blood. What does that mean? There is some sort of nourishment that's happening, some sort of spiritual nourishment, some providence that God is doing at this table as we eat, as we drink. That Jesus is the bread of heaven, and we feel and experience that happening as we are sitting around the table. So those are 7 chairs. There's probably more. That's all that this guy came up with. You probably can think of 3 or 4 more. But the point isn't how many chairs are at the table. The point is asking the question, what is God doing at this table? What is happening? What are we doing at the table? This morning, we're going to gather around the table again after Dave Schallert gives us some meditative thoughts on the Lord's Supper. But I want to end with this. I know that because of how important and special the Lord's table is, it has been also served and occupied the center of many spirited discussions and debates over the course of church history. And that makes sense because of how important it is. We care about this. And in our tradition, Churches of Christ, we care about this table. It's the center of who we are, of our worship. And lines can be drawn, and I know that there are probably differences of opinion and varying degrees of comfort level with what we've been doing in the past 2 weeks, and that's totally okay. This table is meant to unite people. And if and God forbid that I am facilitating this or doing this, I truly pray against it, that what we do causes disunity. That's not my goal. That's not my agenda. I would never want that. What I do want is to give opportunity for the Spirit to be at work. And like those disciples on the road to Emmaus, to give myself, to give all of us an opportunity to put ourselves in the position where my eyes might be opened so that I might see the Lord, to see him again, maybe to see him for the first time. Who is the table for? Absolutely, it is for those who are renewing a covenant, those who are participating and remembering Jesus. But the table and the invitation to the table could very well expand beyond that as well. So that the table isn't only making a statement about who is in and who is out, but rather answering the question, who is it that wants to see Jesus? And that's a question that I can't answer for someone else. Who does Jesus invite around the table? Maybe it is whomever he calls. And I don't know who that is on any given day. Whoever it is that's in need of encountering Jesus and hearing and experiencing the good news of God. Whoever it is who is in need of their eyes being open. Whoever is in need of seeing Jesus. So we want to welcome everyone today around the table to share in this meal and to anticipate that Jesus will be there, and to prepare ourselves for our eyes to be opened to see Jesus. I want to invite Dave Schallert up now to give our Lord's Supper meditation.